According to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, the median loss incurred by a government employee due to fraud is $50,000. Here in Washington State, governments lose on average $52,000 per fraud incident. From 2021 through October 2025, the Office of the Washington State Auditor has investigated and reported on more than $6 million in misappropriated funds and reviewed cases totaling another $14 million in cyber-related losses. When this type of misuse of public funds is suspected, many times our office conducts a special investigation to uncover the details, including the amount of money involved, schemes to misappropriate the money, and of course the identity of the people responsible. I'm Mike Carter with the communications team here at the State Auditor's Office, and today I'm talking with Brandi Pritchard, SAO's Assistant Director of Special Investigations and a key player helping lead the fight against fraud. Welcome, Brandi.
Hi, Mike. Nice to be here.
If you wouldn't mind, I'd love for you to introduce yourself and give our listeners a sense of your experience here at SAO and how that's led to your current position.
So I started with the office 22 years ago, just bright, shiny new baby auditor right out of college, and worked for one of our local audit teams, which I felt really fortunate to do. The audit team that I worked for, they cover a 5-county region in eastern Washington. So pretty cool opportunity to audit some of our smallest governments. So think like small cemetery districts, all the way up to Chelan PUD, which is the nation's second largest PUD. I enjoyed getting to know our office's different audit types, but to be honest, my favorite was always our accountability audits. So those do include a compliance component, but really my favorite is always the safeguarding of public resources part. So basically what that looks like is we go out, we assess the different areas that a government has. So think they might have disbursements and payroll and billing. We determine which ones we think might have higher risk. And then those are the ones that we select as our audit areas. So then we get to ask questions, perform walkthroughs to understand the system flow. And then my favorite part was you get to put on your devil's advocate hat, or maybe you would call it a fraudster's advocate hat, and help try to determine, are there gaps in their internal controls that could either lead an error or maybe a loss to happen without being prevented or detected. And then if we do find any gaps, that's where we perform testing to see if those controls were exploited. So it's not a fraud investigation per se, but definitely some parallels. And I was really drawn to that. So these audits are really designed to help inform governments on areas where those errors or loss could happen and then help them fix those areas. So I really, really enjoyed that work. And as a quick aside there, I think sometimes people think that our role as auditors is to be the ones to find the fraud. And sure, if we're performing testing over an area where fraud is happening, obviously we hope that we can find it. But our primary goal, and I would think the more important one, is to help our governments be the ones to prevent it or find it for themselves. So I always really liked that work, trying to help find those gaps and then communicate them out. So did a lot of that. And then also as my time as an auditor, I also assisted on a few fraud investigations that did unfortunately pop up with some of the clients that I audited. Then later on, I became the audit manager for the team and just set a personal goal for myself that I wanted to become a certified fraud examiner. So I got that license in late 2016. But my first official role in our special investigations team was in 2018. So I became an assistant director at that time. So I was over 5 local audit teams, but I was also put in the assistant director role over our fraud investigation team. And working with that team on this super important work is honestly really where I found my passion. It's not just in the actual investigations themselves, but really drawn to learning from the cases. I'm fascinated by the human side of fraud, both on the people who make the choice to do this and then also the people that work with those folks every day. I like identifying patterns and red flags, and then I really do like delivering those messages out to other governments through training in hopes to help them obviously prevent in their government. And then because I found my passion in this body of work last year in 2024, I decided to move to a full-time role with special investigations. That's been really cool because it's given me more time and capacity to provide more training, to develop more resources for our governments and our auditors, and then to try to just keep finding new ways to help government reduce fraud.
Quite a journey and quite a wealth of experience. That's terrific. So can you give us kind of an overview of the state of fraud in government today and how that has changed over the past few years?
Sure. So I guess I'll just start by saying it's not slowing down, unfortunately. So we can kind of break it into a couple pieces. So the first is what we would call occupational fraud. So occupational cases are ones where the employee is misappropriating funds from the employer that they work for. So in the context of our government, it would be a government employee who is taking funds from the government that they work for. So when we look at those losses, like right after the pandemic years, so think like 2021, 2022, 2023, in total, each year, those losses were under $1 million each year. And then all of a sudden in 2024, that number jumps up to over $2.5 million. Then right now in 2025, it's October, and we're already at $1.5 million with another estimated $1 million just in the cases that we're currently investigating. So definitely not slowing down, unfortunately. We kind of thought 2024 maybe was just an anomaly year, and maybe 2025 would slow down, but that's unfortunately not what we're seeing. So that's on the occupational side. But I think one of the more notable changes over the past 5 to 6 years is how much is not occupational. So it's that external fraud that's affecting governments. And external fraud, I mean, it's always existed. So think contractor or vendor fraud, for example, or, somebody gets a hold of your credit card number and sells it on the dark web, and suddenly you have external credit card charges that you don't recognize on your bill. But in 2018, external fraud for governments just absolutely skyrocketed. And that's not just for Washington. The FBI puts out their IC3 report every few years, and it's telling a very similar story for internet-based crimes across the nation. But again, back to Washington. So you figure, right during the pandemic, there's that giant wave of fraud and unemployment claims that happen. So we issued a report on that, and it was $647 million in misappropriation, another $461 million in questionable. So combined over $1 billion just for that scheme alone. Yeah.
And is that just Washington State?
Correct. Yeah. So we issued a report. I think it came out in 2021. And so that was the impact just on Washington alone. So yeah, it was. So we have the unemployment. We also have a lot of what we call cyber losses. You might also hear them referred to as business email compromise or vendor email compromise or imposter scam. We've had over 200 cases of those since 2018, and those losses just for our Washington governments is $37 million so far, so that's huge. And then a new one that's been popping up a lot more is mail theft, surprisingly. Feels like an old way to carry out a fraud.
Right,
but
old school, yeah.
Old school, yeah. And that's obviously somebody's intercepting a check that a government has mailed out, and they're either depositing it for themselves, or they're changing the payment information on it and depositing it, or even selling those checks on the dark web for somebody else to edit and deposit. And we've had over 150 of those reports with the losses of over 7 million, but I don't think all of those get reported to us. So that's probably a very underestimated number.
Right.
So definitely a lot with the external losses. And then the last thing I'd say, just one final note about changes over the years, work from home has been another new area that's created some challenges. So we're finding a lot of cases where an employee claims to be working full-time, but they're working full-time at more than one employer at the same time for the same schedule, overlapping hours, so clearly not fully giving themselves to both places. And when those employees are remote, you can imagine it's harder for an employer to physically see if an employee is working for them or maybe doing work for someone else. And it's harder for us to investigate too, because we can't use something like, a door badge scan to say when that person was or wasn't at work. So that's been a new challenging area as well.
Yeah, no doubt. Wow. So you've touched upon, I guess, some of the trends that you've noticed. Are there other trends that you and your team are noticing as well?
Yeah, I would say maybe not a new trend, but definitely a high area of focus right now is fraud in small governments, and especially with small towns. When we look back at, a total loss by government type over the last, say, 6 or 7 years, cities and towns easily comes out on top with the highest amount of loss. I think their losses have totaled over like $5.5 million since 2021. So definitely a lot of loss happening there.
Well, and why would you say that cities and towns are more vulnerable to fraud?
That is the question. That's a great question. And the answer is probably a combination of multiple things. I would say top two factors in my opinion here. But I think one of them is that compared to other government types, I feel like cities and towns have more operations and systems to monitor, and then that gives their employees more opportunities. So if you think about like a really small cemetery district, you probably have one person who has complete control, but they don't have very complex operations. They're collecting money for plots, they're maintaining their cemetery land, and then they're paying expenses. So just a few different transaction flows that need to be watched. But now you compare that to a super small town where one person is in charge of everything. They probably have billing and or cash receipting for probably a lot of different systems. So probably utilities, taxes, maybe dog licenses, maybe they have a pool or a golf course or cemetery or park. And so same thing on the expense side that goes with those too. So a lot of transaction streams for someone to find a place where they can exploit that and take advantage. So it takes a lot more monitoring and a lot more verification to make sure that that's not happening compared to like a cemetery district. So I think that's the first factor. And the second one is we definitely see a lot of turnover in small governments. And again, for cities and towns, they can't always pay, a very competitive salary to retain experienced finance professionals in those roles. Plus, there's obviously natural turnover in the mayor and council roles, considering they're elected. And those in these small governments, these small towns, those are usually the people that are often called upon to monitor those finance staff. So it can be tough to keep experienced people both in those finance roles and then in those oversight roles as well.
I'd like to take a little time and talk about the fraudsters themselves. What can you tell us about the people that are involved with the cases that you've investigated? For example, their motivation, traits, their habits, perhaps?
Sure. This is the part I love to talk about. It's, I think, probably the more interesting part of fraud investigations. And I think what draws me to it is it's also sometimes the most surprising. So we gave a series of trainings on this actually over the last couple of years. We talked a lot about a typical fraudster and how it might not always be the people that you would expect. So, Mike, I'll put you on the spot here. So if I ask you to picture what kind of a person commits fraud, like what kind of, personality characteristics do they have? Like, can you get a certain like type of a person in your mind?
Well, it's not me, that's for sure. I just want to go on record there. But the phrase that comes to my mind is criminal mastermind. Somebody who really thinks through all this and plots it all out. But you're probably going to tell me I'm wrong.
You are sometimes right. Does that count? Okay, I'll give you yours. Sometimes right. Okay.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think most people, we can all come up with an idea in our mind, and sometimes it might not be a super favorable light in which we see these folks. When I share case studies, trainings, I commonly see a lot of people shake their heads. They sometimes verbally reflect, on what they're hearing by saying things like, what kind of a person could ever do such a thing? So again, we might think not so favorably. And I think most of us might think of these folks as people with what are considered the dark triad personalities. So this would be people who are narcissistic, Machiavellian, or even psychopathic. So sometimes we, again, don't see these people in the best light. And sure, some of them fall into this dark triad personality, but research actually paints a little different picture. So there was this study that came out in December of 2017 in the Journal of Forensic Accounting Research. It's quoted a lot. It's called The Unique Characteristics of Predator Frauds. And sometimes you might hear it referred to as the Hermanson study, but it basically talks about how this picture we have in our mind is only one type of fraudster, and they refer to that as a predator type of fraudster. So like you're saying, these are the folks that are intent on committing fraud, and they're basically just seeking out a way to do it. Again, I think that's what most of us kind of naturally picture in our head when we think of a fraudster.
Right.
But there's actually a second type, and they call that a situational or opportunistic. So I'm going to use my own words here, but I would call these folks otherwise normal, or I might even say otherwise good people who have had some kind of a pressure, some kind of a burden. So it's usually a financial pressure. They have the opportunity to commit fraud because there's a control weakness that they can exploit. And because of those two things, they're able to rationalize what they're doing. And those are the three elements of the fraud triangle that helps us understand why people commit fraud. It's the pressure, the opportunity, and the rationalization all coming together. So again, we've got two types of fraudsters. We've got the predator type and we've got the situational type. So I'm going to put you on the spot again. Do you have any? Yes. Yeah, another quiz. Do you have any guess of which is more prevalent or percentage? What's your guess?
I'm going to say the predator would be 70%, with occupational being 30%. Not even close.
I would love to say yes, but no. But that is a guess that I feel like is very representative of what I would expect would be the answer. Because again, I think this is one of the more surprising things. The answer is that predator that we have in our minds is only about 20%. And that situational fraudster is much more common at about 80%. So,
okay.
yeah, it's kind of mind-blowing. And this makes sense too, when we look back at some of our cases, when we're talking to other people at these organizations that worked with these folks that made this choice. When we ask about these folks, what we usually hear is, they were such a great person. They were so nice. We never would have suspected it. We never thought they would ever be willing to do something like this. And again, it's because I think we have some idea in our minds that only terrible people make this choice. And because they're such terrible people, we can spot them coming a mile away. But like we just talked about, that's not usually the case. Most of them are our known and respected coworkers who, again, they just have some pressure, they have some opportunity, and so they're able to rationalize what they're doing. So talking about the fraud triangle, I think for me personally, that rationalization leg is by far the most fascinating. As we know, our brains can convince us of all sorts of things. Maybe we rationalize why it's okay that we sped a little bit on the way to work today, or my favorite is when I have a really bad day and I'm rationalizing why maybe I can go outside of my set nutrition plan for that day because I deserve it. Or kind of, yeah. I think I had one yesterday of why my laundry could wait until tomorrow. I'm very good at that rationalization as well. But so take that same brain ability to rationalize and put it in a fraud sense. Honestly, the one we hear most often is, I didn't steal. It was just a loan. I was going to pay it back. So again, so if you think about the people who work with these folks, when we ask about them, they say, well, my coworker would never commit fraud. Like, I know them. They're not that kind of a person. They'd never do that. But we have to remember that in the mind of these fraudsters, they aren't stealing. They're just borrowing. And that's, again, a clever way that their brains are helping them rationalize what they're doing. So that's rationalization. On the pressure side of things, gambling, by far, we see in the most. Like if we look back at our biggest cases over the last decade or so, gambling was a factor, I think, in almost all of them. So that's creating this, it's this financial burden that's helping these people make this choice. And then the last leg there, opportunity. We always say that's where we can help, because audits can help with that opportunity leg to identify places, again, like gaps and control weaknesses where folks might be able to exploit it. We always like to say the best way to prevent fraud is to break that fraud triangle by reducing or eliminating someone's ability to carry out a scheme. So that's the value of an audit, is to help with that piece.
Right. Okay. So we've kind of talked about the types of people that are more apt to commit fraud, the reasons for them committing fraud. Can you talk a little bit about the most common fraud schemes that you see? In other words, what methods do the fraudsters typically employ?
Sure. So if we start with, again, the more traditional occupational fraud, so again, employees misappropriating from their employer government, it's really the disbursements-based scheme, and that's not new, but I think sometimes that's a surprising answer as well. I think sometimes when we think fraud, we think cash, right? It's like the most liquid, it's attractive, it's easy to spend, so we tend to want to focus more on cash receipts. But honestly, those disbursements-based schemes are doing way more damage. So think checks, electronic payments, payroll, credit cards. So recently, getting ready for a training, I was looking back at all of the cases in the last 20 years that have had a loss of over 300,000. So that was kind of my cutoff of what I considered to be a large case.
Mhm.
And when we really break those out into schemes, 89% of the dollars that were lost were due to these disbursements-based scheme. What can be convenient is compared to cash receipting, a lot of these disbursement schemes tend to show themselves in the bank statements a bit more. So, for example, like a wire transfer would show up on the bank statement. So do like ACH payments, credit card charges, so show up on a credit card statement. So all of this is a big reason why our number one fraud detection tip continues to be having somebody review those statements. The other gal that works with me in fraud, I love her so much. She says, Benjamin Gates always says the secret lies with Charlotte. And we say that fraud lies with the bank statements. That's like my favorite tagline ever that she's ever said in a training.
I see bumper stickers.
Yeah, I know. It's so good. Well, there's probably a copyright in there somewhere. But anyway, so that's like the occupational side of things. So disbursements. If we expand out to include the external, I talked about it earlier, but cyber losses continue to be the number one loss area for Washington government, both in dollars and in count of cases. There's like some external scammer. They reach out to the government. They pretend to be an employee or a vendor, and they convince the government to change a mailing address for a check or to change like the bank information for the employer vendor. So they might, email payroll person and say, hey, I'm Joe, employee. Please change my direct deposit information to this new bank account. And now the government is sending real Joe employee's check off to a scammer. We have, some real simple solutions with this, which is like literally don't ever trust email ever and verify absolutely everything. But we didn't want to stop short there. So just recently, actually in September of 25, we created a new poster. It's 6 signs of a scam, and it lists the top 6 red flags that we've seen pop up in a lot of the 200 plus cases that we reviewed. So the idea is we create this poster. Folks can hang it in their offices to kind of keep these signs of a scam in the front of their mind. And that poster is available on our website in our resource library, as well as our new resource that we have over reviewing the bank statements.
Excellent. Okay, so let's say that a suspected fraud comes to your desk. Can you outline the process for a special investigation by your team, starting with how your office typically discovers or finds out about a potential fraud and the steps involved with the investigation?
The Washington governments, by law, are required to immediately notify us of known or suspected losses, and they do that through our website. So honestly, that's where most of the losses come to us, is through our website by governments who are doing their statutory duty to report those to us. And then, of course, as you can imagine, sometimes we do find them through our routine audits. And actually, the largest cases that we've had in the past 10 years have all been found by our auditors through our normal routine audits. So for those cases that come in through our portal, though, we start with some type of a preliminary assessment to help us determine next steps. So we do this through a conversation with the government. And really, ultimately, the goal here is just to learn more about the loss to help with triage. So, do they have a suspected dollar amount? What does the government know about what happened? Have they investigated it? And do they have a person suspected that could be responsible? So we gather all this information, and it helps us to determine if we feel like we need to launch an investigation or not. Maybe this is just a smaller issue that we would just handle in a standard routine audit, or do we need to do something more? And if the case moves forward to an investigation, that's where we start working with the government on, are we going to perform the investigation? Have they performed their own investigation and we're going to review that and maybe add on to it? Or even sometimes law enforcement is investigating and we can review what they've done. So that's kind of our next step. And then if we're the ones doing the investigation, we hope for governments that process feels mostly similar to a normal audit. So our staff are asking about processes and roles and responsibilities. What does your internal control process look like, so that we can understand the flow of transactions, the flow of records. And of course, we're performing testing. We're asking for records and support. And then I think one thing that would be different, though, with a fraud investigation is that we hold formal interviews. We always want to make sure that if we have a person who might be responsible for this loss, that we've had an opportunity to talk to them and given them a chance to talk to us about their side of the story and what happened. And at the end, we decide how we want to report out. Sometimes it's a lower level recommendation. Sometimes we issue a public report. And if it is a public report, by standard course, we always refer those over to the local prosecuting attorney and sometimes other agencies. And we don't have anything really to do with what happens after that. We give it to the prosecutor. It's completely up to them to decide if they want to pick up the case or not, press charges or not. So our role is we're simply that reporting agency. Sometimes the local prosecutor will call us to testify, to explain the work that we've done to a jury, but we don't work for the prosecutor or anything. We're just there to tell our story of our work.
Gotcha. So we are a reporting agency, not an enforcement agency.
Absolutely.
So for anyone listening, especially someone who works for a local government or state agency, what can they do to help prevent, detect, and deter fraud in their organization?
All right, I'm going to give you my top 3. There's probably a lot of things, but here's what comes to mind for me. So the first thing I would say is creating an anti-fraud culture in your organization. And by culture, we mean it's not just something that you do once in a while or once in a year. You check a box that's like, oh, we're supposed to talk about fraud today. So making it more of a part of your everyday. And that can happen through continually evaluating your control processes, by making sure you're setting a tone at the top through your leadership, having a shared understanding that you're a trust but verify organization is a big one too. So what I mean by that is making sure that no one's going to take offense to someone asking to review or monitor what they're doing, or, someone asking to see support or backup behind, a report they've made or a verbal statement. I think this is a big one of, just remembering that as public servants, we are the stewards of public funds, and we should expect and welcome checks and balances over the work that we do.
Mm-hmm.
Another part of setting that fraud culture would be seeking out training and other resources to help stay apprised to the latest in fraud schemes. And that really helps with doing fraud risk assessments, which is something that we would definitely recommend is done annually. So fraud risk assessment is basically, again, putting on your fraudster's advocate hat and saying, where do we see gaps in our internal controls? And, you can't always completely eliminate fraud. So when you find those gaps, asking yourself, what controls do we have in place that might catch that, detect that scheme shortly after it happened? So going to these trainings to understand the latest fraud schemes helps you take those back to your fraud risk assessment and go, okay, I just heard about this new scheme. How would that play out in our organization? Is there something that we could do to help either prevent it or detect it timely? So that would be my number 1, is setting that culture. Number 2 is what I said earlier, and I'm laughing because our special investigations team probably says this literally every day of our lives, but that's reviewing the bank statements. I mean, we've got stickers and handouts and all sorts of things, but as I mentioned earlier, reviewing the bank statements is so important, especially with those disbursement schemes. Our office just continually, as we're investigating these instances of misappropriation, we're constantly finding ourselves saying like, oh, here it is on the bank statement. If somebody would have looked at this bank statement sooner, they would have caught it, or somebody would have caught it. So we did just issue a new resource, again, on our website and our resource library. This just came out in September. And it talks about bank statements in general, and then it has a guide at the end that walks you through in 30 minutes or less how you can perform a bank statement review. We're really excited about this resource. We hope that it's going to help, even experienced finance professionals who've maybe done this a million times. Maybe it'll point them to some new risks or considerations. But more importantly, earlier we talked about small towns is where we're seeing a lot of cases pop up. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons that it can be difficult is you might have a mayor or a council person who's asked to review the bank statements who might be less comfortable doing that. So we hope that this guide would help them as well. So that's my number 2. Okay. And then I would say number 3 would be trying to segregate out the key financial duties as much as possible. Again, I know that can be a little difficult in small governments, but we have a guide on our website in our resource library again. That's our segregation of duties guide. And I absolutely love this one. In the end, there's an appendix where you can look at the number of people you have in your finance department. And then it will show you how to segregate out duties system by system and where you can replace, if say you've got 2 people, you can only segregate so many duties. It'll show you what kind of monitoring to pop in there as well. So those would be my top 3. Yeah.
Okay. So what's the best way for someone to find out more about these resources and report a suspected misuse of public funds?
I would always point people first and foremost to our website, which is SAO.wa.gov. That's our general website. We do have a page specifically dedicated to fraud where you could find some resources and also the link to report a suspected loss. So that would be sao.wa.gov/fraud. You could also reach out to our fraud investigation team. Our email is pretty easy to remember. It's fraud@sao.wa.gov.
There you have it. Thank you so much, Brandi, for sharing your expertise with our listeners today, and thanks for fighting the good fight against fraud. Once again, people can visit sao.wa.gov/fraud to learn more about the state auditor's fraud prevention efforts and resources. As always, if you have questions about any of the work or services provided by the Office of the Washington State Auditor and how it benefits Washingtonians, you may visit our main website at sao.wa.gov.